Pancake, everyone! If you think that a prison or a camp is a correctional institution, today we will tell you about places where people were tortured, mutilated, subjected to experiments, but certainly not transformed into conscientious citizens. And for the most resilient, we'll show you a prison where people were stitched together to study the bodies of twins. Watch until the end. A fence made of barbed wire with an electric current running through it. A slogan, "Work sets you free," on the gates. A massive trench and a wall with 7 guard towers. Behind them, there are brick walls of the gas chamber and crematorium, and thousands of people for whom nothing can help anymore. This is one of the most terrifying places, and it's where we would like to start to pay tribute to the innocent people who remain there forever. Initially, the camp was created for German and Austrian political prisoners. Gradually, Jews began to be sent there. During World War II, prisoners from all European countries arrived at the camp. French, Poles, Balkan natives, Russians. Medical experiments were conducted on the inmates to study the effects of gases, pressure, cold, and toxic substances on the human body. They were placed in decompression chambers infected with various diseases so that different drugs and vaccines could be tested on them. Often, surgical experiments were carried out without anesthesia. The system of punishments developed in Dachau was later adopted by all other Nazi death camps. The leaders and guards of other death camps received training here. In the training ground where SS soldiers were trained, prisoners from the concentration camp were used as living targets. American soldiers liberated Dachau on April 29, 1945, but for many inmates, salvation came too late. According to the memories of the prisoners, the last months before the liberation of the death camp were the most difficult for them. Supervisors took their revenge on the weak for the failure of the Nazi machine. But if you think that Germans were the first to invent torture and experiments, then you're certainly mistaken. Next, we will tell you about even more horrifying examples from earlier times in human history. The Mamertine prison is one of the oldest structures in Rome, founded long before the birth of Christ. It is located at the foot of the Capitoline Hill near the Forum, beneath the Church of St. Joseph the Betrothed. It's a damp, dark place, forever sanctified by the presence of Saints Peter and Paul. The Mamertine prison consists of 2 levels, upper and lower. The most dreadful place was, of course, the lower level. There was no entrance or light down there originally. Prisoners were lowered through a round hole located between the 2 levels. These were state criminals sentenced to death, and their bodies were thrown into the Tiber River. With the advent of Christianity, martyrs for the faith were also held here. Thus, for several months before their execution, the holy apostles Peter and Paul were tortured in this prison. But execution was a relief for many martyrs, because often they were first dragged through the city tied to a chariot, barely alive, before being returned to the lower level, repeating until there was no one to return. Prisoners were hardly fed, beaten and tortured with metal instruments, trying to break their will. In Asia, they also dealt ruthlessly with those who were undesirable. Today, Hong Kong is a free economic zone with freedoms not found in mainland China, but in the past there was also a prison lawlessness. One of the most heavily guarded facilities in Hong Kong, built in 1937, remained the most sought-after place for executions for a long time. Although it was located in a fairly upscale area, terrible things happened within the walls of this prison. It was only in 1990 that the government decided to close it, but in the first 20 years, 122 criminals were officially executed. In addition, the prison became part of an internment camp where 600 inmates were killed during the Japanese occupation. Refugees attempting to cross the border also ended up in this prison. The number of inmates was about 3,000, far exceeding the acceptable limit. Provisions and the desire to supply this overcrowded prison were lacking, so people were forced to eat rats, which were considered a delicacy among the inmates. As for water torture, it's not even worth describing. Now let's return to good old England, which was always known for its care for prisoners. It existed in southern England from the 12th century until 1780 and is known for horrific descriptions and chronicles. It's said that the unbelievably terrible things happened there in every era, starting from trips to the gallows and ending with bonfires for witches, as well as anyone else who happened to be at hand. Back then, it was easy to determine. If you were red-haired and beautiful, you were destined for the stake. The name the Clink is believed to have originated from the sound of a closing metal door or the clinking of chains used to restrain prisoners. Over time, this word became synonymous with any prison or cell in the English language. The history of the Clink prison is rich in scandals. The conditions in the Clink were horrifying. Prisoners were tortured, beaten, and punished for transgressions and sometimes just for the sake of it. There were periods when enterprising jailers simply seized women, raped them, and then sold them to the inmates, only to release them later, but only after a ransom was paid. The prison was attempted to be burned down by disgruntled citizens several times, and it was only successfully burned in 1776 during the Lord Gordon's riots. It was not rebuilt after that. Today, in the museum, interiors with dark cells, torture instruments, and other archaeological relics are partially recreated, and visitors are told chilling stories. And now we'll tell you about a very minimalist version of a prison, almost like Diogenes, but extremely cruel. Nomadic peoples also had their prisons, and their concept was even more terrifying than classical dungeons or concrete boxes. Why build a structure and provide security when you can stuff a person into a box? Apparently, the Mongols thought so, borrowing a similar torture method from their Chinese counterparts. As far as can be judged now, box prisons were used to punish political prisoners or open rebels, and only occasionally undesirable citizens. In other words, such torture was applied not for criminal offenses, but as a means of terrorizing disloyal elements. Moreover, box prisons did not necessarily entail death by starvation and thirst. Sometimes prisoners were tortured to near death, then intimidated and humiliated, and finally released. However, in some cases, execution was indeed practiced, and it was sophisticated. They would continue to feed and hydrate the condemned, but only minimally, prolonging their suffering and delaying the inevitable death. Furthermore, they could be transported and exhibited as a warning to all. There were also accounts of collective boxes where dozens of people were placed in these boxes positioned close to each other. This place of confinement gained notoriety due to the cruelty of the guards, issues with insufficient food, uncontrolled overcrowding, rat infestations, and human rights violations. This particular aspect is noteworthy as the United Nations has drawn attention to this place, but the authorities blatantly ignore all appeals. Inmates often die from chronic illnesses and some attempt to escape. However, no one pays attention to this. They live in constant fear of possible torture and prolonged beatings, which sometimes lead to death. Therefore, being killed during an escape attempt is sometimes even the better alternative. And if you believe that the reputation of such places cannot be cleansed, the next example is specially for you. This magnificent 5-star hotel, part of the renowned Four Seasons chain, is located in the premises of a former prison that once bore a sign at its gates reading City Prison for Homicides. This state institution operated as a conveyor of torture and political assassinations for almost 50 years. The 4-story building, devoid of comfortable rooms but equipped with watchtowers surrounding the entire courtyard, primarily housed creative individuals and dissidents. Writers, journalists, artists, intellectual dissidents, and fighters against the regime of that time. Consequently, the treatment was as one would expect, with people being subjected to the most excruciating methods of breaking their spirits. The prison remained abandoned from 1969 until the early 1990s, when it was transformed into a luxury hotel. After all, why let such a prime location go to waste? Previously, people feared being sent here, but now they don't want to leave. The irony of history. Now, how about a prison on an island without drinking water? The authorities in South Africa came up with this idea. This maximum security prison has a long history. The island had long struggled with the lack of drinking water, making it a challenging place to live. However, this didn't stop the state from banishing unwanted and errant individuals here. From 1846 to 1931, the island functioned as a leper colony. It was also used to exile the mentally ill and those considered as such. During World War II, the island was fortified with forts, and from the mid-1960s to 1991, it served as a maximum security state prison. The overwhelming majority of inmates were black political prisoners. The prison maintained an extremely harsh regime, and civilian access to the island was completely restricted. From 1964 to 1982, Nelson Mandela, South Africa's first black president, was held there under the number 46,664. Other notable inmates of Robben Island prison included anti-apartheid activists such as Walter Sisulu, Governor Mbeki, and Robert Sobukwe. Typically, political prisoners were kept in deplorable conditions in solitary cells, which were psychologically unbearable. Essentially, it was an experiment in breaking one's spirit through isolation. And this experience is still highly applicable today, as it can break the will of almost any person. Dubbed the Israeli Guantanamo, this is a secret detention camp for prisoners of the Israel Defense Forces (IDF), deemed high risk. It is located in northern Israel, just an hour's drive from Tel Aviv. The existence of the camp remained hidden from the public until 2003, possibly due to the incredibly inhumane treatment of prisoners. Those who served time there reported sexual violence, torture, tiny lightless cells, no running water, and long periods of solitary confinement. Israeli authorities claim that the prison hasn't been used since 2006. However, considering the efforts made to keep this prison a secret, even going so far as to remove it from Google Maps when it was non-functional, there is no guarantee it will remain closed. Furthermore, no one can access the area and consequently, nobody can find out what goes on there. Prisoners who enter don't come back out, so you can draw your own conclusions. Located on the island of Hokkaido, this prison is considered the most secure in Japan's history. For nearly a century, it was where the most hardened criminals were sent to endure the snow-covered shores of the Sea of Okhotsk, where the winter storm winds brought drifting Siberian ice flows. A sentence to Abashiri was practically a death sentence, and the bridge connecting the prison's territory to the outside world was the final frontier, leading to oblivion for many desperate yakuza. Despite the very strict regime, escapes from the prison did occur. The most famous was in 1944, when Yoshishiro Tori, a thief and repeat offender with Houdini-like talents, who had become renowned for escaping from every prison where he was held for life or awaiting the death penalty, managed to escape from Abashiri. It's said that he could dislocate his joints and squeeze through a gap as narrow as a palm's width. Nevertheless, escaping from Abashiri required superhuman abilities, getting out of handcuffs and the cell and then running 120 kilometers in a single day. However, he was eventually recaptured. And here is another example from a dark past that many have forgotten, even though the history of this building is scarier than many modern prisons. The tower has earned an infamous reputation as a place of monstrous torture and the execution of hundreds of people. This fortress is one of London's main landmarks and is listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Over the years, it has served as a fortress, palace, repository for the crown jewels, arsenal, mint, observatory, and even a menagerie, and ultimately a prison. Despite numerous renovations and reconstructions, the tower still exudes a powerful impression. Since its transformation into a prison in the 16th century, numerous historical figures have passed through its gates, with very few emerging alive. Within the tower's walls, King Henry IV was killed. Young princes Edward V and Richard were murdered, 3 queens were beheaded, and the basements held the bodies of around 1,500 people. Guy Fawkes, who attempted to blow up the Parliament building and the king during the Gunpowder Plot, was executed here, as was the renowned explorer and poet Walter Raleigh. It was a torture chamber, an inhospitable place to survive, and it witnessed the deaths of countless individuals who can hardly be called criminals. And now let's delve into the most dreadful place, one that can easily compete in cruelty with all the Nazi camps combined. This is perhaps the most horrifying place on our list. There was absolutely no intention to educate or restrain criminals or anyone deemed undesirable. No. Units 100 and 731 were created with one goal in mind: the development and testing of biological weapons, as well as the analysis of the human body's capabilities in various situations. Some military doctors in the unit gained unprecedented experience, including dissecting living people. Vivisection involved gradually removing all vital organs from subjects under anesthesia or local anesthesia, one by one, starting with the peritoneum and chest cavity and ending with the brain. Organs that were still alive, referred to as specimens, were sent to various departments of the unit for further experiments. If a prisoner, despite being infected with deadly bacteria, managed to recover, it didn't spare them from further experiments, which continued until death intervened. Specimens were never allowed to leave the laboratory alive. People were sewn together, attempting to provide one set of organs for two individuals, just to see what would happen in the end. All of this was done with complete detachment and Japanese diligence, and through these places, thousands of Chinese passed, or rather did not pass but remained. As you can understand, modern prisons are like resorts compared to what happened to people in different times. Unfortunately, one thing remains constant. It was almost always ordinary people, political prisoners and inconvenient figures who suffered the most, not murderers and rapists. It's sad, but thank you for watching.